Hello, first graders. We're back to finish the vampire's vacation. So where we left off, 3 people now have band-aids on their necks, which is very strange. And this Dr. A. Kula, who's been staying in the Shangri-La Hotel's name actually spells out Dracula, which is very weird. And now they're going to talk to Officer Fallon to see if Officer Fallon believes in vampires. Chapter 6. Josh called Pal and clipped a leash to his collar. Mom, I'm going into town with Dink and Ruth Rose, he called her the vegetable garden. His mom's face popped up. Okay, but please don't stay long, she said. I need you to watch the twins while I dash to the market. They're always going to the store and nobody is watching the children. Are you wearing your garlic to see Officer Fallon? Ruth Rose asked. Josh grinned. Oops, I forgot. He laid the garlic crown on the picnic table. He broke off one garlic bulb and stuck it in his shirt pocket. No vampire dude is getting me, he said. The kids cut through the elementary school grounds to reach Main Street. Then they took a right on Oak Street and passed People's Pond on their way to the police station. Pal tugged Josh toward the pond. He took a few laps of pond water, scaring a frog. The frog plopped into the water and disappeared. They found Officer Fallon washing his cruiser behind the police station. He had removed his shoes and socks and rolled up his pant legs. Hey kids, hey pal, the police chief said. He dropped a sponge into a bucket, walked over to a bench and sat down. Have you come to help me wash my car? The kids sat on the lawn near the bench. Pal crawled under the bench inside. Pal's everywhere. He goes everywhere with them. Your cruiser doesn't look very dirty, Ruth Rose observed. Officer Fallon grinned. It doesn't really need washing, he admitted. I just wanted to come out here and get my feet wet. He wiggled his toes in the grass. Say, what's that smell? Officer Fallon said and looked under the bench. Has Pal been rolling in something? It's garlic, Josh said. He pulled the bulb out of his pocket. Officer Fallon raised his eyebrows. What are you trying to do, keep vampires away? He joked. Dink nudged Josh's leg with his foot. Tell him, Josh. Josh put the garlic ball back in his pocket. We saw this creepy-looking guy in town, he said. Then began telling Officer Fallon the story. As he listened to the 3 kids, Officer Fallon leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Let me get this straight, he said. This man in black went into Ellie's but didn't come out again. And then you saw Ellie wearing a Band-Aid on her neck? The same thing happened when he went to the book nook, Dink said. The guy had vanished and Mr. Paskey had a Band-Aid on his neck. We found out he's staying at the Shangri-La, Josh went on. And guess what? Mr. Linkletter had on a Band-Aid too. The guy we saw signed into the hotel is Dr. A. Kula, Ruth Rose added. And that spells Dracula. Officer Fallon's eyebrows shot up. Well, I'll be darned, he said. That's why we think he's a vampire, Josh continued. Officer Fallon let one of his hands fall on Pal's head. He rubbed the dog's ears while he thought. I think I saw the same fellow in town, Officer Fallon said after a minute. He looked familiar somehow. I thought so too, Ruth Rose cried. I could swear I've seen his face before today. Officer Fallon stood up. He emptied his bucket and began hosing off his car. Tell you what, he said. I'll try to find this Dr. Cool and have a talk with him. Will you kids be around? I'll be at home, Ruth Rose said. I promised to help my mom clean up the basement. I have to babysit the twins, Josh said. He poked Dink. And Dink is going to help me. I am? Said Dink. Officer Fallon shut off the hose. Okay, I'll let you know what I find out about your vampire, he said, winking at the kids. Dink and Josh walked to Ruth Rose to her house on Woody Street. Ruth Rose's cat, Tiger, was lying on the front porch. Pal tugged on his leash and whined. If you hear anything from Officer Fallon, let me know, Ruth Rose said, picking up her cat. You too, Josh said. He patted the garlic bulb in his pocket. Sure you don't want to borrow this? No thanks, Ruth Rose said. Tiger here will protect me. She kissed her cat on the nose and opened her front door. Dink, Josh, and Pal headed up Farm Lane. They were at Josh's house a few minutes later, and Josh let Pal off his leash. The boys walked around the back of the house and entered the kitchen. Hi, Mrs. Pinto, Dink said. Hello, Dink. Thanks for coming right back, Joshua, his mom said, grabbing her car keys. The boys are waiting for you in the barn. They want to ride on Polly. Cool, Josh said. He and Dink walked through the garden. Josh pulled up a carrot and wiped the dirt off his shorts. Inside the barn, Brian and Bradley were brushing Polly the pony. Yay, you're here, Brian yelled. I want to ride Polly first. No, me first, cried Bradley. I'm a minute older than you. Josh fed Polly the carrot and rubbed her velvety nose. You can both ride at the same time, he said. But I get to ride in front, Brian said. No, I'm oldest, said Bradley. I get to ride in front. Josh looked at Dink. Help me, he begged. That's the end of the chapter. He needs more help with his brothers and with the vampire. Chapter 7. How about if I flip a coin, Dink asked. He pulled a quarter from his pocket. Winner gets to choose who rides in front. I'll take heads, Brian said. So you can have tails, Dink told Bradley. It sounds like when we would play Show What You Know. He flipped the coin in the air and caught it. It's tails. Good, I ride in front, Bradley said. I get to steer. Riding in back is good too, Dink said to Brian. You get to enjoy the ride but don't have to do any work. Thanks, Dink, Josh said. He led Polly to an upside-down wooden box. Bradley climbed onto the box, and Josh boosted him onto Polly's bare back. Dink helped Brian up behind his twin brother. Hold on to Bradley, Dink said. Let's run fast, Bradley yelled. We're not running, Josh said. We'll take a nice walk down to the river and back. Don't fall off, you monkeys. We're not monkeys, yelled Brian. We're cowboys. Holding Polly's lead, Josh walked her into the meadow behind the barn. Dink walked next to the pony, making sure the boys didn't lose their seats. Polly clomped along, dipping her head to munch the top of the weeds. Soon they crossed River Road and stopped on a grassy bank of the Indian River. Can we go swimming? Bradley asked as Polly dipped her muzzle into the water. No, we're going back home as soon as Polly gets her drink, Josh said. There's Polly. Remember they got Polly in the Orange Outlaw when those people were stealing paintings with the chimpanzee. He and Dink sat on the grass and watched Polly drink. I wonder if Officer Fallon found out anything about Dr. Kula, Josh said, keeping his voice low so the twins wouldn't hear. The boys sat and thought about the strange man in black. I've been thinking about those Band-Aids, Dink said. What about them? Josh asked. They were all the same, Dink replied. Why would 3 different people all have the exact same kind of round Band-Aid on their neck? That is weird, Josh said after a minute. You'd think one person might choose a round one, but someone else might use a regular strip, right? Right, Dink said. We're thirsty, Bradley yelled from Polly's back. Josh stood up and gently pulled Polly's head away from the water. Let's go home, girl, he said. Soon they were back at the barn. Dink helped Brian and Bradley off Polly's back, and the twins raced toward the house. Let's go call Ruth Rose and see if she's heard from Officer Fallon, Josh said as he let Pally into the corral. Dink and Josh walked across the yard to the kitchen door. The twins were standing in front of the open refrigerator fighting over a carton of apple juice. Freeze, Josh yelled. The boys turned to look at him. Okay, now please hand me the juice, wash your hands, and sit, Josh said. The twins did as they were told, and Josh poured 4 glasses of juice. He got a box of cookies from a shelf and gave each boy one. Josh and Dink took their snacks over to the telephone on the hall table. The light on the answering machine was blinking. Maybe it's a message from Officer Fallon, Josh said. He hit the play button, but instead of the police chief's voice, they heard Ruth Rose. She said, Guys, I figured it out. Meet me at the Shangri-La. Josh looked at Dink. Figured out what? He asked. Maybe she figured out who your mystery man is, Dink said. Remember, she thought he looked familiar. So why'd she go to the hotel without us? Josh asked. She didn't know we'd be going to the river, Dink said. Well, let's go meet her, Josh said, heading for the kitchen, before the vampire gets her. Dink shook his head. We can't leave your brothers alone, he said. I don't know why not. All the parents do. The kids had finished their juice and cookies. Josh looked out the window over the sink. Come on, Mom, he said. Can we go out and play? Bradley asked. After you put your glasses in the sink, Josh told the twins. Just then, Josh's mom pulled into the backyard and parked the car. Josh waved to her as Brian and Bradley shot out the back door. What'd you bring us? They yelled at their mother. Come on, out the front, Josh whispered to Dink. He and Dink left by the front door and headed for Main Street. They cut through the high school grounds and waved to Howard in his barber shop when they reached Main. They passed the book nook. Dink noticed that the shade was pulled down. A closed sign was stuck in the window. Huh, Josh said, nodding toward the sign. Mr. Paskey never closes in the middle of the afternoon. Dink remembered that little round Band-Aid on Mr. Paskey's neck. Then he shook his head. No, he thought. There are no vampires in Greenlawn. Things just keep getting weirder and weirder. Chapter 8. A few minutes later, Dink and Josh walked into the lobby of the Shangri-La Hotel. Mr. Linkletter was standing behind his counter staring at the door. Hi, Mr. Linkletter, Josh said. Ruth Rose said to meet her here. Have you seen her? Mr. Linkletter nodded. Yes, I saw her about 20 minutes ago with Dr. Kula. Dink's eyes went a little round to the little round Band-Aid on Mr. Linkletter's neck. Do you know where they went? He asked. No, I didn't notice, Mr. Linkletter said. They sat and talked here in the lobby. When I looked up again, they had disappeared. Dink remembered how the mysterious man in black disappeared from Ellie's diner in the book nook. Of course, Mr. Linkletter went on. Dr. Kula could be up in his room. He likes to nap during the day. Josh snuck a look at Dink. Can you tell us which room he has? Josh asked. That would be room 202, he said. Feel free to go up and check. Dink grabbed Josh by the arm and tugged him toward the elevators. Dink pushed the up button and the boys waited. Seconds later, one of the 2 elevators arrived with a ping. Dink and Josh stepped inside. Did you see that? Dink asked. Mr. Linkletter didn't even check the register. How did he know which room Dr. Kula had? Yeah, and he never gives out room numbers, Josh said. He always says guests at the Shangri-La pay for privacy. And did you notice how nervous he looked? Dink said. Josh nodded. His mustache was practically doing a dance on his lip. The elevator pinged and the doors slid open. Dink and Josh stepped into the long corridor and stood listening. No one was in the hallway and it was very quiet. The small wall lights cast a dim glow onto the carpet. This is creeping me out, Josh whispered. What if the guy in this room is just waiting for us? Right now we have to find Ruth Rose, Dink said. He pointed to room 202. Let's go. They tiptoed toward the door. Dink got ready to knock, then noticed the door was already partly open. He raised his eyebrows at Josh, who was staring back at him. Dink pushed the door open a few more inches. Dr. Kula? He called through the crack. Anyone here? No answer came. Josh nudged the door fully open with the toe of his sneaker. There was no one in the room. The boys saw a TV set, a desk, an armchair, and night tables with lamps on both sides of a neatly made bed. It looks like no one's staying here, Dink said. Mr. Linkletter did say 202, right? Josh nodded. The boys tiptoed into the room for a better look. Dink felt goosebumps marching up his arms and legs. Then he noticed a loud hum. The air conditioner is blasting, he said. Next said to Josh with a shiver. It's freezing, Josh answered. He walked to the room and stopped at the closet door. He looked at Dink. Should I open it? Dink nodded. Josh pulled the closet door open, then gasped. What? Dink said, hurrying over for a look. On the floor sat a black leather suitcase. Hanging above the suitcase on the hanger was a long black cape. He disappeared again, Josh whispered. Let's get out of here, Dink said. We have to find Ruth Rose. Maybe she went back home, Josh suggested. Maybe, Dink said as they walked toward the door. Against the wall to the right of the door was a small table they hadn't noticed when they entered the room. On it was a sheet of paper. A box of Band-Aids sat on top of the paper. Dink picked up the Band-Aid box. The little round kind, he said, reading the words on the box. Oh my gosh, Josh said, pointing to some writing on the paper. Dink picked up the paper. It's a list of names, he said out loud as he read the list. Ellie Landolph, and then there's a check mark. Ernest Paskey, check. Lina Linkletter, check. And then 3 names have not been checked off yet. Ruth Rose Hathaway, Dink Duncan, and Josh Pinto. Oh no. The 3 names were written in purple. The first 3 names had purple check marks next to them. The vampire checked off the names of the people he bit on the neck, Josh said. And our names are next. I think I'm going to be sick. Dink studied the list. He was especially interested in the purple writing. Where had he seen that color before? Where have we seen a purple color before? I bet you remember. Then Dink remembered. He brought the paper up to his nose and took a deep sniff. He smiled. What do you smell? Josh asked. Dink grinned at his friend. Jelly beans, he said. Remember, Nate had a purple crayon that smelled like jelly beans. Why would the list be written in Nate's crayon? Chapter 9. Jelly beans? What are you talking about? Josh asked. I think Ruth Rose wrote the list, Dink said, and she used Nate's party purple crayon. Oh, yeah, now I remember, Josh said, but why would she make a list? I don't know, Dink said, and why did Mr. Linkletter let us come up here without giving us a hard time? Why was the door left partly open? Unless Mr. Linkletter and this vampire guy are trying to pull something, Josh said. Suddenly, Josh grabbed Dink's arm. Maybe Dr. Kula captured Ruth Rose and forced her to write this list. I suppose that could have happened, Dink said. He picked up the Band-Aid box and emptied it onto the table. Each Band-Aid was wrapped in thin paper, but Dink could see the round shapes through the paper. You know what I think? Dink asked. Josh shook his head. I can't think at all, he said. My brain feels tired. I think these Band-Aids belong to Dr. Kula, Dink said. And I think he gave one to Ellie. Then he gave Mr. Paskey and Mr. Linkletter's theirs, too. After he bit their necks? Josh asked. I don't think he bit anybody, Dink said. Then why would he give them Band-Aids? Good question, Dink said. He set the box on the top of the purple list. And I think we'll get the answer when we find Ruth Rose. Josh scratched his head. But that doesn't make any sense, he said. How could Ruth Rose know anything? She's just as confused as we are about what's going on. Dink shook his head. No, her phone message said she'd figured it out, he said. So where is she? Josh asked. And where's the guy who checked into this room, whoever he is? Well, they're not here, Dink said, glancing around the room. Let's see if we can get any more information from Mr. Linkletter. Just as the boys stepped through the door, they heard the ping of the elevator. Dink yanked Josh back into the room. He shut the door and they bolted toward the closet. The 2 boys jumped into the closet and pulled the door closed. Inside the dark closet, Dink hid behind the cape, tugging Josh with him. With their backs against the wall, they listened. Next to him, Dink felt Josh shaking. Dink could hardly hear anything other than his own racing heartbeat. Then he heard the door open and close. Feet whispered across the carpet. Something creaked, a chair or a bed. Then only silence. They're not here, Dink heard a voice whisper. Unless they're hiding in the closet, a different voice responded. Dink tried to push through the wall behind him. He tried to shrink. He closed his eyes and willed himself to become invisible, but nothing worked. Suddenly, the door yanked open. Come on out, you two, said a familiar voice. Dink opened his eyes and peeked from behind the vampire's cape. Ruth Rose was standing in the open closet doorway with a big grin on her face. What is going on? This one's very confusing. Chapter 10. Ruth Rose backed up as Dink and Josh stepped out of the closet. Behind her, 5 other people were in the room. Ellie was leaning against one wall, wearing her uniform and apron. Mr. Paskey and Mr. Linkletter were sitting on the edge of the bed. Officer Fallon was sitting in the big chair in the corner. The 5th person was Dr. A. Kula, dressed all in black. He had taken off his dark glasses and was sitting on the floor, leaning against the desk. Everyone was smiling at Dink and Josh and watching their faces. What's going on? Josh asked. The man in black stood up and stuck out his hand. "I'm Jimmy Jett," he said. "Hi, Dink. Hi, Josh." Confused, Dink and Josh shook the man's hand. "He's an actor, not a vampire," Ruth Rose said. She held up a magazine. It showed a picture of Jimmy Jett wearing the same black clothes. The caption read, "Jimmy Jett jumps at chance to play Dracula." "I have a new movie coming out," Jimmy Jett said. "I play Dracula." "Remember I said he looked familiar?" Ruth Rose said. "I saw this when we were helping my mom with the old newspapers. I totally forgot until I saw Jimmy on the TV when I went home after we talked to Officer Fallon." Dink had 100 questions, but he didn't know which one to ask first. He did ask, "Can we sit down? I don't know about Josh, but my legs feel all wobbly." So he was an actor. So there's apparently Jimmy Jett and Ruth Rose, Ellie and Officer Fallon, and over here are Mr. Paskey and Mr. Linkletter and Dink and Josh. Mr. Linkletter made room on the bed. "Sit here," he said. After Dink and Josh were comfortable, Officer Fallon took over from Ruth Rose. "When you guys left me, I came over here to meet this mysterious man in black." He waved at Jimmy Jett, who grinned. "I found him and Mr. Linkletter together chatting like old friends. That's when I learned that your vampire was an actor from New York." Jimmy made a little bow. "I'm sorry if I scared you kids," he said. "I was on my way to Vermont." That's us. "For a little vacation. Greenlawn looked like a nice place to stop, so I did. I went into the supermarket to buy a few things. When I saw you following me, I decided to have some fun." "You knew we were following you?" Dink asked. Jimmy grinned. "Oh, yes, I thought you recognized me and that you knew about my Dracula movie." "But we didn't know," Josh said. "I thought you were a real vampire biting people's necks. We saw the Band-Aids." Jimmy nodded. "I always pack Band-Aids when I travel in case I nick myself shaving," he said. "When I spotted you following me, I got an idea. That's why I went to Ellie's diner." Jimmy looked at Ellie. "You want to take over?" he asked. Ellie smiled. "There I was polishing that glass case," she said. "I looked up and Jimmy Jett was standing in the diner. I recognized him right away and asked for his autograph. Instead, I handed her a Band-Aid," Jimmy said, cutting into Ellie's story. "I told her 3 kids were following me and I wanted to play a little prank about being a vampire." Ellie laughed. "I let Jimmy leave through the back of the diner and I stuck the Band-Aid on just as you kids walked in." "The same thing happened to you, right, Mr. Paskey?" Dink asked. Everyone looked at Mr. Paskey. "That's right, Dink," he said. "Jimmy came in, explained who he was, and handed me a Band-Aid to put on my neck. He left through the back door just as you kids came through the front." Josh laughed. "Boy, were we fooled," he said to Jimmy. "What about that book, Vampires Among Us?" Dink asked. "I thought that would be a nice touch," Mr. Paskey said. "I lent the book to Jimmy, making it look as if he had taken it off the shelf and left the money for it." "You guys are awesome," Josh said. Jimmy made a little bow. "The last step was when I got back to my hotel," he said. "Mr. Linkletter already knew who I was. I had signed in as Dr. A. Kula because I used that name in the movie." Dink looked at Ruth Rose. "What about that list?" he asked. "And Nate's purple crayon?" Ruth Rose laughed. "When I finally figured out who Dr. Kula really was, I came right here to the hotel," she said. "I had Nate's crayon in my pocket. And she forced me to tell all," the actor said with good humor. "I asked her if she'd like to help me with my prank. That's when I made that phone call to get you here," Ruth Rose said. "I wrote the list of names to scare you into thinking you were next." "And it worked," Josh said. "So, you were all in on it together," Dink said, looking at Officer Fallon. "Even you." "Only at the very end," Officer Fallon said. "After Ruth Rose left her message on Josh's machine, I got Ellie and Mr. Paskey to join us here. Mr. Linkletter hid us all in the office until you'd gone up in the elevator." A small smile appeared under Mr. Linkletter's mustache. "Will you guys forgive me?" he asked. They were all in on it together. Chapter 11. The long black limo pulled up in front of a theater in New York City. The driver came around and opened the passenger door. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose stepped out onto the sidewalk. They're in a giant limo. That looks like fun. "Please wait here for your escort," the driver told the kids. "I'll be back after the movie to pick you up." The kids thanked the driver and watched him as he pulled the long black limo back into traffic. "This is so cool," Josh said. All around him, people were streaming into the theater. Over their heads, a large marquee announced the name of the movie, Dracula's Daughter. "It was nice of Jimmy to invite us," Ruth Rose said. "And feed us," Josh said, patting his stomach. "I've never had a picnic in a limo before." "Maybe this is our escort," Jimmy said as a woman in a red uniform approached us. "Are you Mr. Jett's friends from Connecticut?" she asked. "Yes," said Ruth Rose. "Great, then follow me," the woman said. She led them into the theater and then to a bank of elevators. "You'll be sitting in a special viewing box," the woman said as their elevator rose. The elevator stopped and the kids followed the escort down a quiet carpeted hallway to a small door. "Right in here," she said, and pushed the door open. The kids walked to a small room with 4 seats. From here, the kids could see the screen and the rest of the audience. "Enjoy the movie," the woman said. She closed the door and left them alone in the box seats. The kids sat in the comfortable seats and looked around. On both sides, velvet drapes separated them from the people in the other box seats. "I just can't believe we're actually here," Josh whispered in awe. We wouldn't be if you hadn't seen Jimmy Jet in the supermarket, Ruth Rose said. Admit it, Dink said to Josh with a grin. Did you really think he was a vampire? Before Josh could answer, the theater lights dimmed. Down below, the audience became quiet. The curtain in front of the screen slowly parted and creepy music began to play. Behind the kids, a small black back door opened. A man in a black cape entered the box. He sat down in the fourth seat, which happened to be next to Josh. Josh turned. Is that you, Jimmy? He asked. The man smiled, revealing long white fangs. Dink gasped and Ruth Rose giggled. The man took out his fake fangs. Yeah, it's me, Jimmy Jet said. I bought these for you. He reached into a pocket and pulled out 3 sets of vampire fangs. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose slipped the fangs into their mouth just as the movie started. Now they all turned into vampires. It's kind of hard to see their vampire teeth, but they do have little fangs. That's a really good one. What a good mystery. Turned out to be just an actor. That's what happened in the haunted hotel, too. Remember, we thought they were ghosts, but it turns out they were just actors. That happens a lot in these books. Well, I hope you enjoyed The Vampire's Vacation. We'll be back next time to read The White Wolf. See you then. Bye.